Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be back to this wonderful event. And today I will talk about the geopolitics of the TSI initiative amid bifurcation of the global system. And I will answer the question why it matters for freedom. We live in profound geopolitical changes, and if the period between World War I and World War II can be seen as an intermission, the same can be said also for the period between the Cold War I and the emerging Cold War 2.0. So global affairs have become exceedingly complex following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the more or less a very successful globalization cycle that was launched by the West in the 90s. And out of it, it emerged something that I am calling a global system encompassing all of these relevant socioeconomic networks. So the globalization resulted in the very first phenomenon of the human history based on the fact that the majority of the states are capitalist in their nature. And in fact, more or less, we are right now witnessing a process that I will elaborate on in the next few minutes that is going to affect every single country in this interconnected world. So Russia's war against Ukraine is not only about the subjugation of a sovereign country, it is also about the European security order, so it is also a war against the European security architecture that was launched on February 24th. But today I will talk about a third important systemic layer of this war. And I argue that Russia's war against Ukraine was the manifestation of the beginning of the Second Cold War. And this systemic process has been evolving around more or less 5 important trends. The first being the bifurcation of this global system. The second being the ongoing systemic competition between 2 centers of power, namely the United States and China, evolving more or less around all relevant globalized networks regarding global economy, global trade, global energy, finance and monetary issues, and so on and so forth, and including, of course, a competition also in all relevant international and regional organizations. The third important trend I am witnessing is the one that regards more or less increasing tensions between the 2 Asian giants, with China being world economic power number 2, but also with India being en route to becoming world economic power number 3 in South Asia. So obviously this has a lot of repercussions for the old continent, and I'm going to the 4th important systemic trend, and that is the one more or less regarding the US withdrawal from certain spots on the global map. Now, we have been observing certain American withdrawal from the Middle East with all the relevant consequences, geopolitical and geoeconomic ones. But I would like to point to the long-term trend of a possible US withdrawal from the old continent, given the shifting focus towards the Indo-Pacific and the preparation for this systemic competition with China. And finally, what is also very much relevant and is directly impacting the old continent is this kind of fluid state of the international relations that encompasses the more or less hedging play of all relevant regional players. Now, you have heard countless times about the multipolarity, and I argue that at this meta level of the international relations, we are observing exactly that kind of phenomenon of ad hoc, fluid geopolitical constellations between the regional actors, which try to not get caught in a binary world, and which more or less are seeking kind of options to avoid taking sides. So amid these systemic shifts, we are entering a kind of transitionary period in the international relations. And as I said, it points more or less to a bifurcation. Bifurcation means that the system is splitting into two major parts. And if you try to imagine how this global system has more or less evolved into a globalized economy, trade, agriculture, energy, finance, and so on and so forth, think of the great financial crisis and the contagion effects it had all over these networks. So right now, imagine that we are once again entering something very new and quite different from the competition between two superpowers during the Cold War. Why? Because the world has become unimaginably interconnected, and no one can tell us what the outcome of this bifurcation will be. So realpolitik has once again become the true motor of global affairs. You all have heard about the return of geopolitics, and it is more or less about how these two centers of power are going to decouple, and whether it's going to be a violent decoupling or a kind of a scenario of systemic coexistence. And of course, how all of these relevant networks are going to affect our daily life and the life of state and non-state actors. So not only is Washington pursuing this kind of decoupling, but China is equally interested in decoupling from the US-led relevant networks and structures. And why is this relevant for our region? Why should we care about these systemic processes and these relevant geopolitical trends that I've shortly outlined for you? Well, first and foremost, the outcome of the competition between Washington and Beijing will be decisive in determining the new rules of the game. So this competition is not only about economics and about politics, but it's also about the future of the global order in terms of the rules, the standards, the norms, and the values. And as you know, last time the victor of the Cold War was also able to impose its rules and its standards and its values. So here we have a big question mark, because we don't know who is going to be victorious in the fourth industrial revolution in the competition between the United States and China. We also don't know exactly how China is going to be able to convert its geoeconomic cloud into global power projection. And last but not least, of course, we should also care about the ideological component of democracies versus authoritarian rule of governance. So the systemic coordination between China and other relevant partners is also something that we should take into consideration. And here I regard as the most significant phenomenon this modus vivendi of coordination between China and Russia, which already indicates their willingness on the one hand to counter US power projection in all relevant geographic areas, but also in the relevant socioeconomic networks. And on the other hand, it is also a modus vivendi of coordination that seeks to impose new global order. And this is relevant for us because I argue that Russia would have never launched a full-scale war against Ukraine if it had not relied on the overt and comprehensive support by China. But also I argue that by doing so, the Russian president was seeking a pole position in this systemic competition between the United States and China, and also was seeking to impose its norms and its rules, as we heard from previous speakers, on the old continent. Now, if there is one geopolitical project that may be the best answer to this modus vivendi here on the old continent, and I say one, of course, because we have other examples as well, is the TSI initiative. The 12 European Union countries that are positioned between the Baltic, the Black, and the Adriatic Sea, and which should evolve into an European Union-US project that aims to create north-south connectivity, which connectivity should entail transport, energy, digitalization, green projects, and new supply chains. Now, you've heard already from other speakers how important all of these topics are in the big competition between the major players. So in a sense, once again, we see how this region more or less is becoming geopolitically relevant. And of course, this will be necessary to expand the vertical links between the European Union on the one hand and, of course, North Africa, the African continent, and from there also with a deviation towards the Indo-Pacific. Once again, we see how relevant this is. Why? Because it creates a counterweight to the horizontal power projection of Russia and China. So the geopolitics of the TSI initiative more or less offers not only an answer to current problems and challenges, it also is preparing us and the old continent for a future in which we need, of course, to provide a very strong support for Ukraine. One way would be to include Ukraine as a member of the TSI initiative in the future. Another way is to provide the support and facilitate the support for Ukraine as a candidate state, as a candidate country of the European Union. Of course, also what is important is that there is a lot of coordination based on these all very interesting initiatives, and we are already observing the trend that countries that were part of China's initiatives in Central and Eastern Europe are slowly but surely exiting. And one such example is with the Baltic countries exiting the 17+1 initiative by China. So we already see that the Central and Eastern European region of the TSI initiative is becoming this platform for counterweight to China's geoeconomic expansionism. And finally, of course, the TSI countries strive, in fact, for deeper cooperation with both the United States and the European Union. So in a sense, the way I see it is also that they should intensify this institutional and state-related cooperation. And by doing so, they would avoid any kind of bipolarization within the West. Final remarks on my side, and why is all of this relevant for the main question of freedom? Now, first and foremost, we know very well that the Central and Eastern European region has suffered from the satellite role it had during the Cold War within the Warsaw Bloc and within the Soviet Union's partnerships and alliances. And once again, there is this risk of this region becoming a kind of a buffer zone between these two newly emerging competing geopolitical and geoeconomic blocs. So in a sense, once again, the question of freedom, the question of values, the question of standards and norms will become very relevant. Second, of course, is that while an ideological competition is still not avert, and it is more about trade, it is more about economic issues, for the moment, I argue that, once again, the liberal international order under the American guidance is being more or less challenged by a new competitor and is facing new risks and new challenges, which of course are mostly facilitated, as I said, by these coordinated efforts between China and Russia with other relevant regional partners. So here we are going to see this increased competition and this growing challenges on a daily basis. So in order for the Central and Eastern European countries to create a relevant and efficient counterweight, this geopolitical initiative needs to succeed. And finally, the coordinated efforts between China and Russia within the UN international formats and forums within regional organizations, and also with third partners in all corners of the world, and we've heard already about many examples. These kind of efforts are going to increase, so they will continuously challenge, of course, not just the West as a construct and not just the US global power projection, but of course, specifically the European Union-led integrational efforts and initiatives. And here, once again, the geopolitics of the TSI comes to play by successfully uniting Berlin, Paris, and Brussels, and creating a platform also with the United States to intensify all of these relevant infrastructure projects. So it must be a successful project. It needs a successful story. And in the end, I will use a quote why it is so relevant also for the question of freedom. And if you remember, at the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian president said that this war is also a war between two worldviews. And I will even add the statement of best-selling author Nassim Taleb, who actually described or defined the war as a war between two systems. So obviously, in this competition, once again, there will be one winner who eventually is going to be able to impose its understanding of how international relations should be shaped and facilitated. And in our case, in the case of the Central Eastern European countries, we should be very cautious about exactly this kind of competition. And because one of our next speakers comes from Ukraine, I will also want to finish my presentation by using a quote by a famous author, Albert Camus. And he said once that the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. So I argue that Ukraine has become this act of geopolitical rebellion and this act of freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Velina. Let's see if we have any questions from the audience here. Do we have any hands in the air? See one there.
I can see some hand. Can we please pass the microphone to the volunteer? Thank you.
I'm looking at the map of our 12 states member of 3Cs initiative, and it looks awesome, I swear. I'm a big promoter of it in my circle of people, but I also see some empty spaces like Moldova, Serbia, Albania, Montenegro, Ukraine, and I'm wondering what are the eligibility criteria for this country to enter in 3C initiative project?
Well, so far, the 3CI initiative is consisting of European Union members. And here, the basic idea, of course, is to more or less intensify the relations between these member states, to help them coordinate in a better way what are their main needs are in terms of infrastructure. Now, you may know or remember from the time after the Cold War that, of course, most of the infrastructure on the old continent has been horizontally developed. And we've seen the most fresh example with, of course, the pipeline network from Russia towards Europe. And now here the idea is a counter this kind of logic from the Cold War, and to basically build north-south infrastructure. The infrastructure, of course, entails transport, trade routes, digital, and all of these very much relevant topics that the European Union has been talking about over the last at least 2-3 years following the pandemic. So on the one hand, I argue that given the new geopolitical circumstances, it will be the required answer to the fact that the new global power projection and the new global power competition is going to happen in the Indo-Pacific. So how to create valuable value chains and reconfigure value chains. One way would be this north-south connectivity that connects Europe via Africa and also the Middle East to Asia. And I see in this context a growing role for these countries that are still not part of the TSI. So in my view, the one way would be, of course, through the European Union integration. This is basically the necessary condition. 2 of these Eastern European countries have become already candidate states, Moldova and Ukraine. Georgia will become a candidate state as well. It will take a little bit more time. And through intensified ties with the TSI countries, and probably in the next stage also by including them within the initiative, I argue that this will enable them also to speed up the process of political, economic, and institutional integration. So, of course, the necessary condition is the war to be over. This is what we are all collectively doing right now, helping Ukraine to win the war against Russia. But at some point, as I said, we have also to be prepared for the big challenges. And the big challenges are, as I said, coming from Asia. We need to be prepared for this century, for the Indo-Pacific century. And one way will be to incorporate these countries as soon as possible.
Thank you so much for all the presentation and the answers. Velina Tchakarova, the director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. Thank you so much for your appearance.
Thank you.